You talk about examples, because our neighbor of Spring Branch, even though I'm still challenged around the public-private partnerships with charters, I think they exemplify a model of getting it right, what they did with Spring Woods and Northbrook High School. I know in Alief, we had 3 schools and we flipped them, they're no longer on IR. So can you name examples within Houston? Because sometimes I think we forget Aldine, we forget Spring Branch, we forget, and those are city of Houston kids. So in your work, policies that with your influence that you've been able to maneuver based on the data you've been able to provide. And it's really open to everyone, because I think there are some success stories that we need to keep in front of our Houstonians, that every school's not crumbling, and you know, like, we're all going to die. No, we have some grit families and communities that are making it happen in spite of. So if you can offer that, that would be helpful.
Thank you, and I'm glad you bring up Alief. The New York Times a couple of months ago put out an article about the trajectory of students in Chicago, and they were specifically talking about students in Chicago public schools because of the rapid growth, right? Like writ large, the district, the public school students in the district were pretty far behind students in the suburbs or in more affluent school districts. However, what they've noticed is with a lot of the innovation and a lot of the implementation of different programs and systemic changes there, that students were growing 6 years of academic growth over 5 years, right? So it's like they were growing much more rapidly. And within the research that was used for that article was nationwide. And so there's a tool in the article that allowed you to look at other school districts, right? And so I looked at, the Houston area. That was the first place I went to, and noticed that Alief is outperforming many of the other districts in this area, despite having a very high proportion of low-income students and students of color, right? So it's like, you can't necessarily say, well, let's compare Katy ISD to Houston ISD, because that's not apples to apples. But Alief is a perfect example of a majority at-risk student body, a majority students of color, very high percentage of students who are English as a second language, where students are actually growing at a faster rate than the number of years that pass, and at a much faster rate than Houston ISD. So if we look at system levels, that would certainly be a good example. The interesting thing there, and then you mentioned, of course, Spring Branch as well, where there's a lot of innovative programming going on. Governance can be pointed to, first of all, in Alief and in Spring Branch, they have at-large elections for school board trustees. The fact that we have single-member districts is an advantage in terms of representation. However, it's a disadvantage in terms of informed candidates, right? Like we talk about 9% voter participation in school board elections. When you get to the south and east part of town, that gets as low as 6%. And so if people aren't even voting, imagine the types of folks that we're going to be able to find to run for school board, who are informed, who are innovative, and who aren't necessarily just politically driven to get to the next step or whatever it is. And so when we're constrained to single-member districts, we see some difficulty with representation in that regard, with substantive representation. Other factors that happen in Alief has a pretty long history of superintendents who last longer than 3 years. 3 to 5 years, as Chris mentioned, is pretty standard. It's actually 3 years for big city superintendents, large districts. It's an average of 3 years and some change, and that's all you get. Not much time to actually implement a vision and carry it out. We don't see the continuity across the system. And so when there's a stronger administration, especially if they're, if that administration is following a cohesive vision, there's an opportunity to really grow in that way. So there are definitely some bright spots systematically, but the governance structure is different.
I just wanted to build on that a little bit because Alief is not a complete anomaly, but just different in a lot of ways. We actually had 3 of Alief's newly elected trustees apply to our program, and we're certainly welcoming them in. The reason being is because they're interested in, when you think about what you just said, that superintendents last longer, sometimes in the trustees, then actually that's a shift in looking at how do you carry on the momentum that you've had in a district. And so it's an example of going out to a community who has some bright spots, but certainly I know they deal with a lot of mobility challenges, and so we need to explore that and have our trustees also looking at, well, then how do we make the best decisions for a leave context, which is very different for any of the other. So I wanted to add that too, because again, talking about who are we bringing to the table, those are the folks making the decisions, and makes sense.
Great. Other questions? Yes.
I'm going to try to illustrate this a little bit. When I think about kind of the bell curve of society, most of us operate in the sort of conventional 80 to 85% of us can obey most of society's rules, right? From a very macro to a very micro level. If we can figure out what works for the 10 to 15% that may be disenfranchised, or if I can figure out what works for my middle child, I can figure out what works for everyone in the household, right, or everyone in the system. And where schools are concerned, and specifically maybe in our city, we seem to be mostly failing Black boys. And how can we look at measures that are working to increase performance in systems and resources available to kids of color? And how are you guys sort of building that up?
I don't know that, any of us have any, 2-minute bullet point answers on this. I mean, I think there's cities struggling with this all over the country. I think that, there are examples of schools that are doing a great job with this, and I think it's the things that you see in a lot of great schools. There's a dedicated leader, there's a committed staff, there's relationships, there's rigor, there's extra support that kids and families have. And I think, not to sound like a broken record, but in order for those things to happen and those decisions to be made that are in the best interest of the kids in that school, those decisions, I believe, have to be made by those that are closest to the kids. And it's not, here, we're going to roll out the initiative from central office that 100 schools are going to employ, because the kids in those 100 schools are different and what they need are different. And so I think, for me, what I've seen work, whether it's this issue or other issues, is the more we can push those decisions that matter most, how we allocate the budget, how we staff the school, what's the program. I mean, there's standards that every school needs to be able to teach to, but how those standards get taught, how we take advantage of time, what's the schedule look like, what's the school year look like. The more decisions are made by people that are closest to the kids and know the kids and families best, I think typically, generally, that's where we see success. And the more that we treat each school kind of in this cookie cutter fashion, I've got 2 kids that are very different. I mean, they need very different things. And so we have to be able to think about the options that we're providing to kids and families differently, and let folks that know the kids and families that are embedded in the community make those decisions. And I think that's, if I were to summarize what I tried to say in 10 slides, I think we have to think about this in a decentralized way, especially in a city this big and in a system this big. And expecting 9 people or 10 people or 100 people to make decisions for 200,000 kids, just, it hasn't worked. And if that's what we keep trying to do, it's not going to. And so, I don't know if that answers the question specifically, but I think generally that's how we need to be thinking about the problem.
We've been focusing in on Sunnyside community only as a proxy to what's happening in some of the hardest communities. And so we've been volunteering at high schools, Worthing High School in particular, which, if you don't know, has a 4th grade average reading level there. And I remember one Saturday I was there and started off tutoring one child, and then the AP brought in like 7 other children, and I was like, I don't know what to do here, but I was trying, and there were several Black boys there who, and this isn't just a conversation about Black boys, but I know that you ask it in that way, they already had this defeated attitude. And so when we think about what is it that their parents, or if parents aren't present, the people closest to them could be activated to support them better. I believe it's the people in the schoolhouse, but it's also a community like a Sunnyside and the constituents of those schools. What could they do and be incited to do to speak up about what's happening to their kids, to Black boys, to all of the low-income Black, brown children with special needs, children that really aren't being heard right now. So I think about that particular story because I think it's what's happening in the decision making in the schools, but also the community there. I don't want to make a broad brush, statement, but I kind of will and say Sunnyside leaders need to be activated. Parents, students, the people that are there need to really be activated to speak up about what's happening.
Question in the back? Carla?
I was intrigued what you had mentioned about the not-for-profit board, school, and independent board, wasn't exactly followed. Would you elaborate on that and where it's taking place?
If you couldn't hear, she's asking about nonprofit board governance, and for Chris to explain that further.
Yep, I think we see it in a few different forms and fashions. I mean, I think the one that we're all probably most familiar with is you've got, nonprofits that you guys all probably either work for or boards that you sit on. Essentially, a charter school is a nonprofit organization. It's got a nonprofit board. In that case, the mission is to educate kids. But we've also seen examples in Denver and in Indianapolis where the traditional public school, so think of, Rusk Elementary School, rather than that school being governed by the existing board and sort of managed to the central office, the school converts to its own nonprofit board that then has a contract back with a school district, and the district still has oversight over the school. It still regulates its performance, but now that school has the ability to manage the dollars and the staff and all the things I just talked about, program, schedule, like a charter would. It has the same types of autonomies. It has a board that principal reports to, and schools are converting to that status, and they're doing it for a couple of reasons. One, they want to have the freedom to make those decisions. Two, they want to have stability in leadership. So usually the type of leader that's saying, I want to do this, is a high-performing, effective leader. And if they're given that autonomy, they tend to stick around. And for the district, they want to keep those people because, like in Houston, where everyone's recruiting talent, they don't want to lose those people. And those are the people that are the first ones to raise their hand and say, I'm being effective not because of the district, but in spite of the district. And it's usually the person that's like breaking all the rules and pissing everybody off at central office because they want to do things their way. They now have a pathway to stay inside the district and have that same autonomy. They don't have to go out and raise a bunch of money and find a building and do all these other things. And so in 3 years, 70% of the schools in Indianapolis will be set up that way. There'll still be district schools, but they'll have either a single nonprofit board over a single campus or over a cluster of schools, still part of the district. And in Indianapolis, like here, you have a separate authorizer. The mayor's office actually authorizes charters. So it's a way for them to keep enrollment. It's a way for them to keep resources. It's a way for them to keep kids. It's a way for them to keep talent. So those are really the reasons they're doing it.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a question and then we'll get more to audience questions. But I think, to me, it was interesting as we were developing our ideas about panelists, and our donors, our education donor working group all had wonderful recommendations, which included these 3 panelists. But it was noticeable to me that everyone is focusing on advocacy to some degree or another. And not all donors and philanthropists are necessarily comfortable in that space, and sometimes there can be confusion about how do you fund advocacy. And today we have the example of a 501c3 organization, which is a typical charity structure that is a tax-deductible way of supporting an organization. We have Houston GPS, which is a C4, which is not tax-deductible, but an important social welfare organization that can endorse candidates. And we have the Lauren John Arnold Foundation, which through various methods has supported both advocacy through C3s and C4s. So I wanted y'all to talk just a little bit about, why, Jasmine, why did you all incorporate as a C4? Why was that necessary? Petra, to talk a little bit about as a C3, how can you still do advocacy? And Chris, if you would just mention a little bit about why the foundation has chosen a portfolio of different types of organizations to move the needle.
That's a great question, and a lot of people forget about sort of the C4 space because we're not a charity, but we're not quite a PAC. We do work with a political action committee to support candidates, but we entered into the C4 space for the express purpose of being able to influence policy and the actions of elected leaders. Chris mentioned this idea of implementing a system change, either through state takeover, mayor takeover, or having a pro-majority board is the term that he used, which means the elected leaders themselves made decisions. And as an independent school district, Houston ISD and all the other ISDs across the state of Texas have a ton of autonomy in the types of decisions they can make about policy, vision, and budgeting. And so they could themselves decide to create a district wherein clusters of schools have their own nonprofit board that oversees management and governance, and that the school district just operates as an authorizer or as an overseer for accountability. And so in that type of environment, we believe that it's possible to elect folks into office who are that forward-thinking, who recognize that the status quo isn't working. And if we're going to elect them, then we've got to get involved in the political part. So C4 was the most clear lane for us to direct policy and political work.
Great. And Petra, can you talk about the kind of advocacy you can do through C3?
Sure. I think for us, we recognize there's a lot we can do through C3, and so we live in the informing and connecting and activating space. We can really get entrenched in local public policy and holding our officials accountable, but also participating in that policy-making process through various advocacy actions. So that's a space that we live in. There is obviously a little bit of state advocacy that we can do, and we are actually looking to affect change in the school finance conversation, which more of us need to join that as much as possible. But really, for us, it's about activating the electorate to be more engaged in what's happening at the local level, and there's plenty of room to grow in that.
Great. And Chris, do you want to just mention a little bit about?
I mean, I would, if I were to characterize the type of foundation we are, it's really policy foundation. And so, a lot of the C3 work is around, issue advocacy, educating people about everything from education to healthcare, different things. But policy is passed by politicians. And so you have to play in the political part too. So I think we see, both of those things being important for the changes to different types of systems, whether it's healthcare or criminal justice reform or education, that both of those things are important. And so we play in both of those arenas.
Great. Yeah, Caroline.
I have a question for Chris. Where they have instituted this nonprofit board model in school districts, are the resources shifting and getting to the kids more directly? Not getting lost in kind of a mid-ground admin area?
Yeah, the short answer I think is yes. Sorry, the short answer is yes. And it works in different places. I mean, I think this is an area actually where Houston HISD sort of been on the forefront for years. I mean, this idea of decentralization, this idea of student-based budgeting, this idea of dollars following students is something that, goes back to when Dr. Page was superintendent. I think what we've seen over the last 20 years is kind of this pendulum swing of decentralized to re-centralized to decentralized. But I think typically you see more of the resources flowing out to the school. In places where they're even more sophisticated at this, there will be a service menu, like a service menu or service level agreements that schools can buy back from the district. So if they want to buy a bus route, here's how much a bus route costs. Here's how much a food service costs, janitorial, academic services. So schools get the full per pupil. And then principals are given the authority to buy back from the central office what they want. And what happens over time is that the things that are good, people tend to want to purchase, and the things that aren't, now there's a marketplace, and the district office is just another service provider in the city that's providing that, fill in the blank service to the school. I think that's the theory. Other different cities are implementing it in different ways. But I think typically what you see is more of the resources flowing out to the school. And the last thing I'd say in this, just on Senate Bill 1882, one of the things that's interesting about that bill is that it actually has in there that if a partnership occurs, that the school gets the higher per pupil, whether it's the district or the charter. And charters actually get a higher per pupil. They don't get facility monies. But in a lot of the cities, and I don't know what the numbers in Houston, but for example, in a Fort Worth or in Austin or San Antonio, it's about $1,000 more per kid for that school that they would get through the partnership. So I know school finance is a big topic here. This is a way for more resources to actually flow to the school level through creating partnerships like this.
Great. Do we have one final question? Ramon, I see you, so you're it.
So Renee, this is a question for the panel. I'm curious, how do we create more awareness around this issue? And when I ask that question specifically to the average Joe who may not have children in school, because as an entrepreneur, what I think about is, where is my talented workforce going to come from if these kids aren't getting educated? And how this is actually affecting my property values in the largest investment in my portfolio, my home. And so one of the things I think about is, how can we, I don't know if it's a public service announcement, some type of campaign, PSA, whatever it is, how do we put this message out about how important this issue is? Because I feel like folks are asleep around education and they're not connecting the dots on how this affects the city and them personally.
It's a great question. Thoughts and any research to back any of them up?
I think that's an issue across the country, right? I mean, if we look at, and certainly across the state, and how the way that our country and our state decides to invest in education, and there's a huge disconnect. Like anything else, we don't realize it exists until it's broken, right? So I think that actually we are in a moment in Houston where lots of folks are actually starting to pay attention. And so continued conversations like this are incredibly important, and folks sharing. And another piece is, we are seeing more and more the importance of traditional organizing models where people literally gather around a table, 6 or 7 people, neighbors, friends, continuing to talk about the issues that affect them on a regular basis. And even if their kids aren't in public school, they might be an entrepreneur, they might be a business owner, they have concerns that are connected to public education. And so if everyone in here got 8 people to sit around their kitchen table, and then everyone who sat at your kitchen table got 8 more people, that's how this sort of thing spreads. I think that grassroots takes hold. Grassroots movements take hold for a reason, and it's because people trust each other and continue sharing.
Great.
I echo those comments. Shameless plug here, but that's the reason why Leadership ISD exists, to inform people at all levels, and definitely trying to get to that average Joe. But I have to say that as we're an educational advocacy organization, we too adopt and operate with organizing principles, because it really is that grassroots approach. And we already hear so many anecdotes about even people who've been in the field 20 years who weren't thinking about innovation in the way that Chris described. I mean, to hear him and be able to say, oh, you're talking about portfolio districts. Well, we talk about that in our fellowship because people don't really understand that it's not just traditional or charter. There's a hybrid of that, and that's really a lot of what he explained and what 1882 provides. So it does spread by getting people more informed. That's why we exist, to start there, and have them have these kinds of advocacy tools, organizing tools like house meetings, but also doing the research to further explore these topics and share it with their network. So it's shameless plug for us.